Okay, so we've got one here from Adrian on Facebook. And Adrian has asked, what's the difference between the customs union and the single market?
Great question. Essentially, I mean, this is going to simplify too far, but essentially the customs union is about trade policy in goods. It's about things like tariffs and do you have checks at the border to ensure that you meet rules of origin requirements. The single market goes beyond the customs union in that it's not just about trading goods, but it's also about liberalising trade in services. So, for example, allowing British banks to serve the rest of Europe. It's about harmonising regulations. So you can kind of think of the customs union as a lot of stuff going on at borders, but harmonising regulation is going to affecting the whole economy beyond the border. And then what's also part of the single market, and this is key, is migration. Right? So the single market has what are called four freedoms, which is the idea that goods, people, capital, services should all be free to move within the European single market. So it's the single market, which is why we currently have free labour mobility with the European Union. So it's kind of much more extensive than just the customs union.
And could you give us an example of what you mean by regulations?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, right? So, for example, suppose you're making a car in the UK. It'll have to meet certain safety standards, right? Now, currently, those safety standards, are going to be part of the sort of European regulation of the car industry. If I was making a car in the US, there would be a different set of regulations I have to meet. So you can think about what safety standards does this car have to meet. So what the single market does by trying to kind of harmonise regulations across European countries is ensure that a car made in the UK meets the same standards as a car made in France or a car made in Italy. But if we leave the single market, that will no longer necessarily be the case, and that makes it harder to trade with those countries.
And does that mean then that we would have to come up with our own set of regulations separate to the EU?
It would be an option, and one of the kind of argument that's put forward in favour of Brexit is that sometimes EU regulations might not suit the UK economy very well, and so being able to tailor our own regulations would be more beneficial. But we could also just choose to kind of mimic EU regulations. If we wanted to avoid the costs that come from having different regulatory standards, we could just say, whatever the EU chooses, we'll adopt that. And so the advantage of that approach would be to keep the costs of trade low by having the same regulations. The disadvantage is if you think Brexit should be about taking back control, then you've gone from a process where the UK negotiates with all the other European countries about regulation, so we at least have a say, even if we're not the only person in the room, to now just accepting EU regulation that's set when we don't even have a vote on that regulation. So it would be a loss of control in that case.
And this is another question related to this. How are regulations in other countries decided then? Because we've spoken a lot about how they're decided in the EU and how they could be maybe decided by the UK. Do we have any kind of comparisons we could draw between how other countries decide?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest way to think about it is that, if you think about kind of nation states as being the locus of political power, right? If you think about the US, who decides regulations in the US? It's the US government, right? So, and kind of to a first approximation, that's a good way to think about it. The complication is that once you start to do trade agreements with other countries, even if you're not in the single market, they often have something about regulation in them. So maybe they might say, well, we agree to kind of negotiate over regulations in a particular area, or sometimes you have we agree to recognise your regulation as being equivalent to ours. So they do feature a bit in international agreements, but for the most part, they're decided at the domestic level.